Hello, I'm Hazem Seeker. This is Counting the Cost on Al Jazeera, your weekly look at the world of business and finance. This week, the Italian job. Whoever leads Europe's third largest economy into 2017 will have to fix the nation's debt-loaded banks. We tracked down the man who predicted the 2008 financial crisis and asked him just how worried the rest of Europe should be about Italy. Also this week, the cost of protecting the next US president on the ground and in the air, as Donald Trump calls out Boeing for the cost of Air Force One. Plus, Dubai to Doha in under 23 minutes. We'll chat with the founder of Hyperloop, the ultra-high-speed transport concept that aims to get you from A to B at the speed of sound. Let's start this week in Italy, which is in the grip of political transition and a slow-burning banking crisis. Prime Minister Matteo Renzi resigned from his post this week after losing a referendum on constitutional reform. He'll stay on until a new caretaker government is formed, but it's not just political uncertainty that's worrying Italians. Their economic future now hangs in the balance. Italy's banks, its oldest in particular, are in trouble, saddled with billions of dollars worth of loans that can't be repaid. Sonia Gallego has more.
It's the start of the Christmas holiday season here in Italy, and that's well underway. Of course, there are religious overtones, but the shops here are also making consumers know that they can spend whatever money they have here. But this is a season that is set against a political crisis which has been affecting Italy's economy. And also another very disappointing statistic for the Italian government, that 1 in 4 Italians are now at risk of poverty and social isolation. You go to the south of the country and half of the people living there are also affected by that same poverty. So it really is not good news for the Italian government, which is trying to keep as much stability as is possible. Many Italians have little faith that things will get better soon.
The lower classes are feeling the pressure. Unfortunately, what's missing here are more employment opportunities. This is the savage effect of globalization that's taken jobs away from here.
Shops lower their prices, but people are not buying.
You really feel the pinch at the end of the month when you calculate how much money you've spent and see what's left, which is very little compared to what it was a few years ago.
Italians have seen their wages fall also in the past few years, and this against an economy which has barely seen any growth. It's still suffering the hangover of the recession. And also what's been affected is the country's exports as they face off stiff competition from countries such as China. And this, with the political crisis that hit the country in the past week, has ensured that Italy enters 2017 in a decidedly weaker position. I'm Sonia Gallego for Counting the Cost in Rome.
Now, the question for many people is, will Italy's economic problems develop into a new test for the future stability of the Eurozone? And who better to answer that question than the man who predicted the US subprime mortgage crisis? We caught up with him in Doha this week. George Magnus, thanks very much for being with us.
Thank you.
So first off, is what we're dealing with in Italy right now rooted in the financial crisis of 2008?
Well, of course, the referendum that's just been overturned really was about constitutional reform. But the fundamental problem that Italy has failed to deal with and needs to deal with very, very urgently is a banking crisis because its banks have been allowed to accumulate lots of bad debts. The economy's had no growth for like 12 years. So it's not reckless lending on the part of Italian banks, but just the fact that a stagnant economy has not provided borrowers with the wherewithal to be able to service their debts, and banks have had to keep shoveling out new loans to keep them going. So the problem is they have huge non-performing loans, bad loans now, and woefully inadequate capital.
So should these issues have been dealt with a lot sooner then?
Oh, without question. I mean, we look sometimes nowadays at the financial crisis, what seems like an eternity now ago, but after Lehman, so in the United States and the United Kingdom. And the reason we don't have banking crises in those two countries now, as far as we can see, is because the banks were recapitalized forcefully and very early. in conjunction with other financial and monetary policies. But this didn't happen in Europe, and it particularly didn't happen in Italy. And the lack of growth in Italy actually is really the corrosive ingredient really that's actually soured the Italian banking system more so than in other countries.
What does all of this mean then for ordinary Italians? I mean, you talk about the lack of growth there. What implications is that going to have, particularly for the young generation of Italians? Are we looking at another lost decade for them?
As you implicitly suggest, they've already had one. I mean, in income per head terms, and so this is in the world of kind of aggregates, but income per head in Italy is now about 12% lower than it was when Italy joined the euro in 1999. And actually the level of income per head is no different from what it was about 12 or 15 years ago. So I think that the problem for Italy, I mean, the growth problem they can't fix very quickly. That's going to take a long time, and it will need stable government to do that. But the urgent problem that Italy has now, to avoid not only a financial crisis for itself, but one that could spread very quickly into the Eurozone, is a banking crisis. That they have to get on top of as fast as possible.
Well, let's talk more about the Eurozone then, because with Italy we're talking about the third largest economy in Europe. What implications is this going to have for Europe as a whole, and the overall policy of dealing with the stagnant economy across the continent?
Yeah, well, the part of the problem that Italy has an issue with its banks is that banking union directives and rules which have been put together in the last 3 years actually prevent the Italian state from doing things that it might otherwise have done, which is basically to use taxpayers' money to kind of get rid of the problem by recapitalizing the banks very quickly. So the Italian government needs to find alternative solutions, either in the private sector, or it needs to seek exemptions or a bending of the rules by the European Commission in order to try to save itself from punishing the depositors. Lots of retail depositors in Italian banks own bank bonds, and they own government bonds, which the values of which have been declining, of course, because of the deterioration in the health of the financial system. So the political problem for Italy is to avoid basically crucifying retail depositors, because if that did happen, then whenever Italy should have national elections, whether it's scheduled in 2018 or if it should be earlier, we don't know at this point, then we'll see a real test of the populism in Italy, because I don't think people would react very well to a situation in which taxpayers and ordinary consumers and households were being asked to pay for the follies of the banks. So there's a kind of a toxic mixture there between what looks like ostensibly a financial sector problem and the political background against which it's taking place.
Speaking of the populism effect that you talk of, that's something that we've seen throughout several countries in the Western world. Obviously, Donald Trump, the incoming US president, he is espousing a policy of fiscal stimulus, lower taxes, possibly more government spending to revive the economy there. That contrasts with what we're seeing across most of Europe, which is this kind of monetary easing, buying up bonds, record low interest rates. How do you see those two contrasts there?
Because this is a very interesting time, because for many years now, since the financial crisis, we've all become kind of accustomed to the economics and the politics of austerity and a reliance on monetary policy as the sole source of economic management. Now here comes President-elect Trump, who seems to be holding out the prospect of a much greater use of what the IMF calls fiscal activism, which is basically really about the use of fiscal policy, budgetary policy, to try to fund Well, they want to fund infrastructure spending, they want to fund tax cuts for corporations and individuals as well. So the details will become clear in the new year, or clearer, and we'll know a little bit more about how much of these programs will be funded. But the significance really is that America is going to be walking on two legs again, as we might say. So it's got a relatively easy monetary policy, even if the Federal Reserve raises interest rates a couple of times. But then fiscal policy, budgetary policy will be working as well, one imagines, to try to push the economy forward. So whatever the medium-term outlook for America, this change in the budgetary outlook looks like it's going to push the economy forward in 2017, although of course there will be some costs to that. Bond yields will go up, the dollar will go up, and not all countries will welcome that. But the contrast with Europe, for example, is very, very stark, because in Europe we don't have, or Europeans don't have, any kind of coherent kind of fiscal strategy in the way that the United States under Trump looks like it might develop.
You famously predicted the subprime mortgage crisis in the US, the housing crisis that led to what happened in 2008, the biggest financial crisis that the world has seen since the 1930s. So I'm wondering, would you care to look at your economic crystal ball again and see what's in store for the global economy over the next few months?
So I think my economic crystal ball has really become a little bit of a political crystal ball, and therefore not very crystal at all. It's quite unpredictable. My biggest fears, let's say for 2017, I suppose really relate to the integration and the coherence of the EU actually, and of the Eurozone. Because if things went awry in Italy and bolstered the prospects of the populist movements in Italy, the Five-Star Movement and the Northern League, I mean, both of these parties have threatened that they would hold a referendum to leave the Euro or the EU. We have elections in France where Marine Le Pen of the National Front is campaigning on a virulently anti-EU program. I mean, she may not get elected, but the climate in Europe is facing, political climate, I think, is colouring the economics, and really it's quite dangerous, because it's an existential moment for Europe. I think we worry about America under Trump, but the Republic will probably survive him. The risk may be that we get a kind of a boost to the economy in 2017, but it's at the cost of instability later on in the presidency.
George Magnus, thanks very much.
Thank you.
And still to come on Counting the Cost, a bridge for the 21st century. Could this crossing ease London's congestion problems? Now, Concorde took to the skies 40 years ago, but was eventually grounded for good more than a decade ago. With it, the dream of high-speed travel also stalled. But it's being revived, this time closer to the ground, in the shape of passenger pods designed to be propelled along a network of vacuum-sealed tunnels. A US startup company called Hyperloop One has inked an agreement with the government of the UAE to conduct a feasibility study in Dubai. The idea is to move passengers at near supersonic speeds at a fraction of the cost of air travel. Let's get more on this from Bebop Grester, chairman and co-founder at Hyperloop Transportation Technologies. He joins me via Skype now from Kuala Lumpur in Malaysia. Thanks very much for being with us. This is something that has attracted a lot of attention over the last few days. It's certainly ambitious. And just how fast is it really? I mean, what kind of speeds of travel are we talking about here, and what sort of a difference is it going to make?
In Hyperloop, it's an amazing fast system. We are expecting to travel at 1,223 kilometers per hour. So a little bit more than an airplane. But it's also efficiency, what we are looking at, because by using renewable energy, solar panel, kinetic energy, wind, and in some climates, geothermal, we can have up to 20% more electricity than we consume. So it will bring down the cost of maintenance and also the price of the ticket to a level that has never been seen on the ground.
But the initial costs do seem quite prohibitive. I mean, is it really worth it from an economic standpoint?
That's quite the opposite. If you look what we are spending in high-speed rail or the normal rails, we can look at costs that are half or 1/4 of the cost that is actually spent to build this kind of systems. But the system is not only cheaper in building, it's also cheaper to maintain. Because if you compare it to the high-speed rail, all these systems are subsidized by the state. The Hyperloop is capable of recouping the entire investment in 8 to 10 years. And then you have a system that is profitable. So there's a big difference between our system and the traditional ones.
There is, of course, the issue of safety whenever a new transport innovation like this comes out, and convincing people to get into a tube like this that travels at the speed of sound might prove a bit daunting for some. Is that going to be a challenge, do you think?
Well, first, we are already traveling at almost the speed of sound when we are traveling on air. The A380 goes at 1,000 kilometers per hour. So we are not any different than an airplane, but it's safer because it's enclosed in a tube. It means it's protected. It's protected from the external environment. And the technology that we are using, it's already tested by the several science that we developed in the last 50 years. We know how to build a tube, we know how to build a pump, we know how to keep the passenger safe, and we also know how to stop it. And we have airlocks every kilometers, and we can evacuate the people in 30 seconds. So the entire system, if you look at it, it's 10 times safer than an airplane.
And more generally, we're seeing a lot of innovation in the transport field, self-driving cars, drones. Apple recently announcing it's getting into the car business, a connected car. Who are the players, do you think, in your view, that are at the forefront of this?
If you look at the impact that the electric car has had in the industry is historical. Now every single manufacturer is building an electric car. So what Elon Musk did to transportation with the Tesla has never been seen in the last 2 centuries.
Bebop Grester, thanks for being with us. This week, Donald Trump became Time Magazine's Person of the Year. But while he's been filling up magazine covers around the world, the U.S. president-elect is racking up a hefty bill. How much does it actually cost to protect the next leader of the free world? Well, too much, says the mayor of his hometown, especially when he happens to live in the heart of one of the world's busiest cities. That's why New York is asking for $35 million from Washington to keep Donald Trump's residents safe. Here's Andy Gallagher.
If New York is the city that never sleeps, then Midtown Manhattan is its beating heart. It's never quiet here, but ever since President-elect Trump's victory, his home and now political headquarters has presented the city with some unique challenges. Traffic here often comes to a standstill. Crowds gather for selfies and a possible glimpse of the next US president, but it's all coming at a cost.
Today, I'm sending this letter to President Obama.
New York's Democratic Mayor Bill de Blasio says if the US government doesn't foot the bill, then it goes to the city's taxpayers.
What we will be asking in the letters today to the President, to the administration officials, to the Congress, we will be asking for up to $35 million in reimbursement for the period November 8th to January 20th.
3 photos, folks. 3 photos while there's still a free press.
For New Yorkers like Tom LeClaire, who's been protesting outside Trump Tower every day for the past 2 weeks, the prospect of paying for Trump's security isn't going down well.
Obviously, I'm not too crazy about that. I'm a resident of New York, a citizen of the United States, and I'm not too happy about paying for security for someone who insists on having 2 residences.
In the past, these kinds of operations have led to the city being reimbursed, and it's a general rule of thumb that keeping the president-elect safe is a federal responsibility. So far, there's been no response from Trump's transitional team or the White House. Even by New York standards, the sheer scale of this operation is staggering. These barriers run a block north and a block south, and all of this is costing the city an estimated $500,000 a day. And when Donald Trump is inaugurated on January the 20th, it may not come to an end, because his wife and son will stay here in Trump Tower, meaning this operation may continue for some time to come.
We just wish it weren't required, which means we wish he were the president-elect.
How they do it in the past, it needs to be the same way. It shouldn't be any different.
This is the first time that the New York Police Department has played such a crucial role in protecting a president-elect, and it's a duty city officials say they take seriously. Ultimately, though, it's a financial burden that they don't want to bear alone.
Now, President-elect Trump has been vocal about cost as well. He's taken issue with Boeing's contract to build the next Air Force One jet.
Well, the plane is totally out of control. It's going to be over $4 billion. It's for Air Force One program. And I think it's ridiculous. I think Boeing is doing a little bit of a number. We want Boeing to make a lot of money, but not that much money.
The White House and the U.S. Air Force, though, have questioned that $4 billion price tag quoted by Trump. Nevertheless, Boeing's CEO said the company will work to limit the cost of the new Air Force One and deliver the best value to taxpayers. It's also worth noting that Trump has his own private plane, which boasts a 24-carat gold-plated sink. And finally, we'll end this week's show with a look at London's famous Tower Bridge. For the first time in decades, the 120-year-old landmark is closed to road traffic for much-needed maintenance. And now there are calls for a new river crossing. Neve Barker takes a look.
For several months, London's iconic gateway has resembled a building site. For the first time in 40 years, major works happening to restore timber decking and parts of the bridge that open for boats. Bridgemaster Chris Early leads us deep beneath the towers into a cathedral-like space. When the bridge lifts, massive weights swing through here. It's 19th century engineering at its finest. But the bridge is used by 40,000 people a day and more than 20,000 drivers. That's a lot of wear and tear for a bridge built in 1894. The closures also created serious congestion in other parts of the city.
Since it opened more than 120 years ago, Tower Bridge has helped with London's continued expansion east. It's now one of the busiest crossings anywhere in the world. But its temporary closure has raised some big questions about whether it's time for London to have a new bridge to meet the capital's changing needs.
There are 32 bridges west of Tower Bridge, but none to the east serving central London. Instead, commuters have to use ageing road or foot tunnels like this one in Greenwich. But could this be the answer? Plans for the first lifting bridge across the River Thames since Tower Bridge. The architect certainly thinks so.
Most cities in the world have grown up around a river, and then they actually become viable when there's a crossing across the river. We need these bridges to the east of London to be able to allow London to grow and to cater for its sort of prosperity into the next century and beyond.
The bridge is designed only for pedestrians and cyclists, serving a city of the future that's less reliant on cars. With the right backing, the team's hoping to finish the bridge by 2020. But does it have what it takes to become an architectural icon?
This project is an amazingly exciting project. It's the longest bascule bridge in the world, the second longest lifting bridge in the world, and we've really tried to look at 21st century technologies in order to achieve what we're looking for here.
The Romans built London's first bridge to improve trade, around which a city sprang up. Many hope this addition will be the start of a new chapter in the life of the city.
And that is our show for this week, but there's more for you online at aljazeera.com/CTC. That'll take you straight to our page, which has individual reports, links, and entire episodes for you to catch up on. You can also get in touch with us by tweeting me at Hazem Seeker, and do use the hashtag AJCTC when you do, or drop us an email. countingthecost@aljazeera.net is our address. That's it for this edition of Counting the Cost. I'm Hazem Seeker from the whole team here. Thanks for joining us. The news on Al Jazeera is next.